Okay, so in the spirit of the new Star Trek, which I actually really haven't watched yet, I think I've only watched one episode, and everyone says it's amazing, and you're not in yet. I didn't enjoy it.
Don't watch them. Don't watch Star Trek.
But in that spirit, today we're going to talk about Data. See what I did there?
Oh, it's not the new Star Trek. No, we need to start again. That's embarrassing for you. That's really old Star Trek. That's like 20 years old.
But no, he's in the new series. Oh, spoilers. Well, I don't know. I've only seen the first episode. Anyway, yeah, so we're going to talk about data. Particularly around the idea of who owns your data. And the reason that question is important because who owns it is basically, what follows on from that is who gets to do what with it. Who gets to do what with it? Who gets to make money out of it? Issues of consent. So there's going to be things that we're going to talk about this. Because if the question is who owns your data and subsequently what's happening with it, then what we got to think about is theories of property for a start. Because there's going to be competing theories of property. There's going to be some people that say, websites, social media websites, etc., own your data because you use their platform. And you consent to that when you sign up to it, right? And then there's going to be other theories of property which we'll look at, which might contest that. So I don't want for us to presume that, like the talk did, that we'll probably link somewhere in this podcast that people can watch if they want. But I don't want to presume that you do own your data like those talks do. I want actually to kind of hone in on that question as well. Then we'll also look at well, if the problem is about privacy and things like who owns it and how to control misuse of data, then the idea of protecting data becomes around, either bringing in privacy legislation or monetizing it. So it becomes a kind of commodity that you own that you can then sell. And they're the two competing theories, really, about how to protect the misuse of your data. I think that also the conversation will probably, other themes that will come into this will be potentially about this kind of growth in this technology, I guess, and the economies that can come out of it. And I've got some notes written down that will kind of delve in a bit more about the commodification of your data and things like that. So in that video that, again, some people can watch, but it's not necessary, I think, if you I don't want to set homework, like you said in our pilot episode. But we are all having data trails. That's how I understand it, right? Everywhere we go, we leave like a cloud of smoke behind us.
Oh,
you're laughing really patronising.
Oh, it's just on the conspiracy theories already.
So okay, let's think, first of all, then hone in on this point. The question of who owns your data. Why is that an important question, Ads? Why is it important?
Well, I think it's important because it's caused a lot of upset. The thought of who owns your data upsets a lot of people. And it stems from the idea that these social media platforms and websites, Google and such, are making money off of you somehow. And I think that comes from people feel that they're then missing out or something, like they should be making that money or they've been robbed somehow, when actually that's not always the case. That's not, like, I think a lot of people don't realize that one individual's data is very rarely like worth anything, only in very specific cases or very specific bits of data. But all the value for those kind of organizations comes from when they have the millions and millions of rows of data that they can use to make predictions and micro-targeting campaigns and things like that.
So there's a first kind of point of people feel almost cheated.
Yeah.
So that's something that we're going to need to discuss. So that definitely is, I think, perhaps maybe that is something that people will feel more, or that's definitely from what I've seen in some of these talks and things I've read. That's one of the angle that people are taking who want you to consider data your property. You're being robbed. It was the first thing mentioned in that type of TED talk, right?
There are more, we can get into this as well. There are far more sinister concerns, and there are some people that are very concerned about their privacy, quite rightly so. I'm a bit cynical and believe that anyone that really wants my data has probably got it. I'm not smart enough or careful enough with my own data. Like, I'm maybe just a bit lazy in that. Do you know what I mean? I signed up to many of these websites when I was like 13, 14 years old, when they were sort of just happened, and use same email addresses over and over again and all that kind of stuff. So it's quite hard to clear up a trail that's that long and that kind of messy, considering I only really started to learn about data and kind of the ins and outs of what can be done with it in the last 5-6 years.
Okay, so from the first point about feeling cheated, there's also a question about how far this is going to go, this economy, right? Because if it goes to a point where your data can become valuable, but as you said, at the moment it's really only valuable as a collective resource, right? Not an individual resource. So, and that
Speaking generalization,
that brings me to mind of a kind of a Pink Floyd analogy, right? So I think it was this Great Gig in the Sky where they got a backing singer to come do a great vocal, and that vocal makes the song. Without that vocal, that song is all right. And they gave her £100, and that was it. Now, maybe it's a better model to offer people percentages in certain situations. So do you think that data is something that, if it becomes such an economy, that we need to look into models where people are giving a percentage of the money that a company makes off of your data?
But
is
then,
that a potential model?
Maybe, but analogous to that,
I don't expect you to answer this now, because we need to come back to the question, right, of, well, do we own it? But that's maybe something to simmer away a bit.
Yeah, okay.
And the second thing you've said was about the horror stories, and that's going to bring out the other theme of this, which is consent. That's very, very interesting, because you sort of said, oh, I've probably done this. But you don't sort of necessarily always know.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's interesting, because the point I want to make about that is that in any other context, I would find it very worrying that the obligation to know what's happening with your stuff, which is based off of your consent, is on you, the one who's giving the consent, and not the one who wants your consent. That sounds quite wordy, so let's kind of make this a bit simpler. You know, think about relationships between human beings, right? If I was seeking your consent, let's say for a sexual relationship, I would definitely, I think the obligation would have to be, the emphasis would have to be on me 100% making sure that you are fully informed and fully aware of everything that's going to happen and the consequences of that. And if you're not, the law tends to look at me in that situation if something happens and say, well, you've done something coercive, right? So why does that change in a different circumstance? And I just also want to add in here that I'm not being facetious here, because in the video that we watched, which we'll link up, one of the things that the guy says is that the iTunes consent form for your data is over 700 pages long. Now, that's going to put off all but the most studious of lawyers. And they actually said a team of lawyers couldn't completely figure it out. And then the other thing around that is we always talk about these things presuming the idealized human capacity, right? This is a thing, actually, ironically, a lot of philosophers get accused of. And in that, we forget other people in the conversation. What if you've got a learning disability? What if you actually have barriers between you and getting informed about that consent?
Yeah, it's the similar issue with the free market, assuming everyone has perfect information, and that just breaks down because people don't.
Oh, now talking my language.
But that's it, and the argument around consent is really interesting, because in that case, talking about lawyers can't unpick it, then has that been made purposefully opaque? Or you could say giving a document that explicitly outlines everything that was going to happen with that data, that is as upfront as you could be. But quite rightly so, is that, if that's inaccessible to people, that they can't understand it. And I think that's why people don't realize that these companies are making money off of you. It's why, like, finding out what member of Star Trek crew you are and things like that, all these harmless quizzes, you don't realize actually you're feeding ad agencies your personal data and preferences and answers to questions about you, so they can then feed that into market research. Like that's what they're for. They're not, people just don't make random free quizzes for the fun of it. Well, some people do, but the vast majority of them are there to collect data on you around very specific questions and give you, and more importantly, give that company access to your Facebook profile data and things like that.
So, okay, we've got these two things then of, why is this question important about who owns data? It's one, because there's a kind of a sense of entitlement around it. And that's the one about theories of property, I guess. And the second one, as you've said, is about people worrying about what's going to happen to their data. And that's therefore about consent. Let's come back to the theories of property in a minute. So I think at this point, people are really going to hear, I don't know let's be sensationalist. Let's hear some horror stories. Yeah. Because if this is important, this question, we need to understand, right, from someone, an expert like you in this case, what could happen to this data. Why do I need to be worried about this?
I can't remember how last time we spoke about this, I kind of cut you off with something and I think it shocked you, but I'll tell that story because it is a good one. Yeah. So in my previous life as a data scientist and insurance company, we had loads of data about you, actually. You don't understand how much information you put into the big price comparison websites. So if you hook up to, that was a great job, because if you hook up to the big 4 price comparison websites and you get all the quote data, you get roughly 1 million quotes a day for car insurance. And when you sort of normalize those 4 data sets into a standard, you end up with, I think we had 996 columns at the time. It'll probably have gone up since then. So that's 996 bits of information about you and your life that you've put in. And with that, I can do all sorts of stuff if I really want to, like go and look you up on the internet, add in social media data and things like that. You've told me the value of your properties, some of them. You've told me where you live. You've told me how many accidents you've had, all this kind of stuff. I can look all that up. I can go and get Ordnance Survey boundaries for your house, and I can go and get free satellite imagery of where your house is and cut that out, and I can run that through machine learning models to tell me, within pretty good accuracy, how much your house is worth, your car's worth, the crime rates and things like that in your area.
But why am I worried about that?
Because that affects something very material to you. So you've put that. So in that case, you've put your quote information in, and you've consensually added that to the website. If you were to think that they don't keep your data, then I think you've misunderstood what those services are about for the organization. But it's the other stuff. So you're very aware of that, and that's maybe not as much of a problem, and maybe not aware that there's the extra data sets that we can pull in. And actually the GDPR regulation that came in kind of threw a lot of that into the air, and it stopped some of that stuff happening. You could do a whole episode on GDPR. It's very complicated, and lots of people are still kind of trying to find their feet with it, but it does enable you to unravel some of that, or actually get people to delete your data and things like that. And you're within your rights to take it off of companies that have it, which is interesting. So that probably feeds into the who owns it conversation a bit. But the other one was,
why am I worried?
Yeah, but it's when you aren't aware of what's being collected that I think can get quite scary. And the big one being worked for. So when I worked in insurance, I sort of heard a lot of horror stories about the dark sides of AI and machine learning in insurance. And there are supermarkets that run banks and insurance companies and all sorts, sell you other products, and they like, we've all seen them, they'll do it. And so an interesting story was around it's believed if you look at the data a certain way, there is a correlation with higher risk for defaulting on credit agreements in insurance and people that come from Eastern Europe. But it's legislated against that. You can't charge people more because of where they're from. You can't do that in the UK. You're not allowed. So Okay, the insurance industry believes that these people are costing them more money, but I can't charge them anymore just because they're from Poland or whatever. I feel like I can get away with saying some of this because I've got a Polish surname and my granddad was Polish. So it's not I'm not as sort of treading on eggshells as some people might be. But right, so I can't charge you more for being Polish, but I can charge you more if you buy food from the Polish aisle in Tesco, for example. And so if you go to the supermarket and you buy your shopping and you beat your card and you get your points, and so add up for your £2.50 voucher at Christmas every year and go away. What you don't realise is that card, that data is being used by that organisation to sort of inform lots of other decisions they make. So if they upsell, if you go on to then quote for an insurance product, your price might be higher for the very fact that you once bought Cabanos from the Polish food aisle. Or if you regularly buy it, probably more likely there's more of a correlation, and that's not protected against. That's not in the rules. Or the other one was the Scrabble score metric. So another way kind of round this issue, and I don't know if this is real or a bit of an urban myth that gets told, but I heard it from a very reliable source that I trust. But what they would do is take the surname of an individual quoting for their insurance and calculate the Scrabble score. And the higher the score would give a modifier that increased your insurance premium, because that's not protected against in legislation. But because there's a correlation between it, lots of Eastern European names have lots of K's and Y's and Z's in them.
Well, your name's Schroker, right?
Yeah, so I've got a K.
Yeah. So what kind of... I see a tension. I mean, this is obviously... When we talked about this originally, I was a little bit gobsmacked. So I can't quite pretend to be like that now, even though I still am sort of shocked by it on a deep level, because it... First of all, there's a couple of things here. The first thing you said is it's the ones you don't know about. And I don't consider myself to be particularly politically naive, right? Otherwise I wouldn't be working in the profession I am. I had no idea that loyalty cards were about that. And I totally just assumed they were about what they said they're about, because it makes sense from a consumer point of view. I save money, but they also get me going back to the shop more. I had no idea it was about collecting data. And that deceit must make us suspicious, right? Well, at least misdirection. Let's not call it deceit, perhaps. But then the second thing is there's a big tension with this collecting of data when it's around stereotypes, because what we see is a general, well, maybe not anymore at the moment, but at least a positive thing, perhaps, right? Well, not perhaps, it is positive. A positive thing about society, recently has been to look at these harmful stereotypes, whether they be based around ethnicity, gender, or anything else, and try to pick them apart and challenge them. So one, we don't judge people in those ways, particularly when they have negative stereotypes attached to them. And two, they don't become self-fulfilling, because if you grow up seeing that stereotype presented to you, and you are of that group, then you probably will end up sort of self-fulfilling that prophecy, right? So that's why representation is so important in intersectionality and politics like that, right? So I see the collection of data presenting itself almost as and this is the problem I have with the market, almost as if it's a neutral thing. Well, we're just collecting information because this is about making money and this is about the market. When, these judgments are an economic necessity for this company. But surely if we're trying to overcome these stereotypes and challenge them and not create self-fulfilling prophecies with them, this exact practice is in opposition to that, right? And we could take this in many different ways, because that's what advertising does, right?
So that's really interesting. And yeah, I agree with you. One of the other, probably worth touching on, but the other big concern is, of all the loyalty card schemes that are out there, I couldn't tell you which ones sell your data on to other people. Data brokerage is a huge way. It's a really, really good way to make money if you're a company that collects lots of data, selling it on to other people. But So interestingly, around advertising and stereotypes, actually, in some of the work that we do is exactly about undoing that. And so, the reason these mass generalizations fall into the media and into advertising is because if you might only have enough budget to do one advert, so you're gonna target the biggest group or the most valuable group that you can target, and you're gonna make lots of little assumptions and things like that, and come out with something probably that doesn't really feel very real. And that's kind of where we are, right? Because of the media that we consumed up until very recently, it was predominantly in print or through the television or through the radio. That's all changed, and we're all streaming more than anything else, really. And there's some really interesting things. I could go right down a rabbit hole here, but one of the things that there's a product that we're helping to deploy for a few of our customers now that lets you very easily and very quickly do micro campaigns and micro niching of customer bases. So instead of splitting your customer base into 4 or 5 segments and doing maybe 3 campaigns, it will split into thousands of segments and do thousands of really targeted campaigns. Because if the cost to generate that campaign is really low, i.e. it's been fully automated, it's done by an AI or something, it's done by a machine learning model that generates an email that gets sent out, or it generates an image, it's all possible now, that gets sent out, then actually I can create hundreds of them, like thousands of them, for less effort than it would have cost me to have a person sit down and craft something nice and general that fits the bigger group. And so one of the things I kind of band around in the Art of the Possible workshops about where things are going. The whole idea, we've seen like deep fakes, these videos of like President Obama speaking, and it's not him. He's saying like, have you seen that? These deep fake videos?
Yeah, they did one, didn't they, a while back?
Loads of them now.
Yeah, Corbyn and Boris Johnson in the election, I think.
So how about this for 10, 20 years time, some sort of dystopian future where you're on your social media and an advert comes up for, I don't know, a new car, and the advert is you and your friends in the car in the video.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, it's like...
That's only computational power is the only limit now, really, on that.
Yeah.
We can do that. That's quite... like, if you give me enough time, I could sit and build that thing for you, that advert. So computational power and the kind of technique gets a bit more advanced. That'll become standard practice. So just all your adverts will be you in the thing, much like Minority. Was it not Minority Report, where he's getting all these super targeted adverts? Yeah. That's not far off now.
Yeah, and so I guess this leads on to another micro issue, and I haven't forgotten about the property thing. We will come back to that. But as soon as this has come up naturally in the conversation, there's one thing I want to kind of add on to this too, which is even ignoring all of the more insidious things that we're talking about, right, which are important because that's the kind of difference, I think, really, when we get into the idea that, you know, data can obviously be owned by a state as well, right? But we focused a lot on companies. So maybe we could have another podcast after this about why we'd be worried about the state owning that stuff, because that's a kind of different kettle of fish. But there is also a thing with companies is that they don't have the same level of obligation, right, to do that. So, I mean, think about this in a very simple way. Like, let's say car insurance generally is more expensive for men, I think, because, you know, men have more accidents, right? But this kind of peddles the sort of deeply entrenched kind of, maybe subconscious, a lot of people that, oh, well, women are safer drivers because women are, you know, not risk takers, you know, women are safe, and that's kind of harmful, right? And it's also harmful to assume that men are just aggressive, and it gets repackaged to us, and then we kind of get told that we, you know, if you're not like that as a man, then, you know, it's a dog eat dog out world there. That's how you become successful. So it becomes self-fulfilling. And I think that companies that work in data, that sell things, that they sell them based off these stereotypes. Those stereotypes and learning about those stereotypes are profitable to them. And I'm not denying that the statistics are true, because they clearly are, right? If they're empirically true, they are. But the question then becomes, why are they true? And that's why it's important, right? And companies don't have that obligation, that social responsibility, as much as they like to say that they do. They say that when it suits them. You know, they say that when they want access to these markets. And then they don't actually practice that, really, because it's profit motive, I guess. But I've just gone on a massive aside from my aside. But Yeah, go on. Sorry.
But so interesting talking about that and put then stereotypes. I was really fortunate a while back to we got the opportunity to support a tech startup that did marketing, and it did exactly that kind of micro targeting, and it looked at the sort of temporal evolution of clusters of individuals within a customer base for organizations that uploaded their data. It was really good around retail. And speaking to the founders and the CTO of that company, that startup, they said that the first time they showed it to marketing departments, the feedback was, can you make the segments like bigger and less of them, please? In fact, could we just have like a handful to work with? So although we had the capability to really target it's all like small groups of people and get really detailed, breaking apart stereotypes, actually taking that information and turning it into something useful that you can then go and do a campaign on. Many people aren't there yet. Like just those methods and processes aren't as well developed.
Yeah, and that is interesting. And I do think at some point we'll need to talk about that this isn't all just doom and gloom. Like, you know, like you said before, Google Maps is great for certain things. But the other kind of aside I just wanted to make as well is that if all of this resource that companies have is engineered at getting us to buy stuff. So I just want to refer back to your point about seeing you in the advert, you know, scrolling down your Facebook and you're seeing targeted advertising, things like that. I do wonder that, first of all, this seems to encourage impulse buying, and that can be problematic, right? Because anything that can be put in front of you whilst you're doing something else, I feel like you know, me going on a website because I want to buy a pair of shoes instead of going, oh, that looks cool, oh, I'll just buy it then. I don't know if we want to cultivate that. There's no protections against that. It could be a 12-year-old on Facebook, and I remember before you talked about this computer game thing, right?
That was it. Yeah, I think it was one of the states in America actually outlawed loot boxes for games because they deemed that it was gambling, and there's no regulation in. So these games where you log in and you play, and they're free to play, some of them, and it's the only way these companies make money is by you buy these little loot boxes, and they're like, you get random stuff in them. It might be new items for your character, it might be like new skins, but when you open the loot box digitally, you press the button on your controller and it opens. That whole experience is engineered to be as exciting and as exhilarating as possible to get people really addicted to doing it, because obviously the company wants to make the money and do that. That all seems fair. But the random nature of it and the way that all the best stuff is actually really, really low chance of coming out, it was deemed actually, no, this is gambling and it has to stop. So we need to stop this altogether. And that's the idea that if a 12-year-old went into a betting shop with £6,000 on a credit card or whatever, it wouldn't be allowed. In fact, I'm not even sure you can bet on a credit card in the UK. You certainly can't buy lottery tickets at my post office. But if that kid's playing a game that's hooked up to a parent's credit card through the phone or whatever, you hear these stories of kids that spend like $12,000 on sort of FIFA players. I think it was the one I read. The kid kept trying to buy the best FIFA players from this game. I just think that's unregulated, but it's still as dangerous, if not more so.
Yeah, and I do think there's also an environmental point to make about this, is that, you know, is it surely the last thing we want to be doing is ramping up impulsive consumerism, or throwaway consumerism, which is what some of this is about, right? Because there are environmental consequences of that. It should be sensible consumerism, and I think there is something about the fact that it's put in front of you whilst you're doing something else. It's interrupting, and it's quite interesting because now as sort of TV kind of disappears slightly, right, I've got used to watching programs without being interrupted by an advert, right? But that's just kind of transitioned to something else, another place. And then we're back at the consent thing. Oh, well, you've consented because you're on this platform. But I don't know. Then we get into theories of consent a bit more, because one of the, challenges to this would be to say, well, a choice is has to be consent relies upon a choice, right? You have a choice of doing something else instead, but that choice has to be meaningful. So, you know, the extreme of that would be, let's say that a highway person comes up to you and says your money or your life, right? Well, there's not really a choice, is it? So what we end up is that are there other coercive structures around which force you to take one choice instead of another, because you'll be seriously disadvantaged. Now, if I run my own business, for example, and I don't have a Facebook page, I suffer from that, right? And socially too, right? If all my friends, I mean, we do live action role play, right? That's a hobby where so much around Facebook is connected around that. If we're not on Facebook, then we might have lack social credit or something like that. So that also concerns me. I think there's a garden party going on a couple blocks down the road. I am muting my microphone when I'm not speaking. Yeah, it's quite large, quite loud. Anyway, so that is a point too to talk about, or to think about at least, because there's lots of these. I feel like these are trajectories of conversations, and we have to kind of just lay those thoughts out and say what do you think about that? But because at some point we're going to have to come back to this property thing. But you look like you want to say something before we do that.
Well, no, that's, I think, just to kind of surmise that, yeah, you sign up to these platforms, and the cost of doing business with a platform, the perceived benefits are you get access to your friends, you get all this stuff, great, really easy to do searches now that I've got Google. But the cost of doing business is you're letting them watch you, kind of thing. Sounds really creepy when you sound like that. Maybe that will put people off, but you're letting them watch you and watch what you're doing.
Yeah.
And if that's getting sold on, or you've basically relinquished control of your own surveillance.
Yeah, you know where it goes.
And one of the things really sort of is a good conspiracy theory for you. I often wonder, like, is it the reason these companies don't pay tax across sort of the UK? You hear about Google dodging, what was it, 130 billion in tax or something bonkers? Probably not as much as that, but is it because actually they're saying to the government, well, look, we're not going to pay you any tax, but that's everyone's data?
Get my tinfoil hat ready.
Yeah.
I mean, there is also, I do want to, on that point about tinfoil hats and these conspiracies, I do want to actually say,
let's just scrap this data thing and do conspiracy theories instead. He's so much better.
God, not right now.
Lizard people, episode 2, lizard people.
I'm not simply being a classic, left-leaning, whatever that means these days, academic, right? I definitely want to say, one of the things I want to say is that this is something that I definitely recognise, because, as you know, I used to be in a band, and I used to try and sell. This is back in the day, trying to sell music. Yeah, no, I was trying to sell music.
And buy a CD after the podcast.
Like I said to you last time, right? Jonathan, when I was living in Bournemouth, every time I used to come down an escalator with him out of Asda, he would turn around to someone, get up the other way, and say, "Do you know he's in a band?" Which would make me look like a complete dickhead, but trap me from not looking like a dickhead, and that was it. I'm screwed. Anyway, I digress. We sort of actually have to take a bit of responsibility for this, because on one of the things that was really interesting to me in the video, I think it was one I linked, but some other stuff I was looking at and reading, which we won't link because I can't remember what it was. But interestingly, the point that was made was we turned ourselves from consumers into commodities because we sort of stopped refusing to pay for stuff. We had a generation that expected music for free, expected social media platforms to be free. And we've got this idea of using things for free. And though, all of these platforms, YouTube, all that kind of stuff, would therefore had to find a way to make money. And the way to do that was to turn us from the consumer into the commodity ourselves. And so data collection, emerges. And I think we do have to take responsibility for that a bit, maybe. Because we're part of it, right?
Yeah. I mean, some of these services are really good. YouTube's really good.
Yeah, but
Like, Google's really good.
imagine if YouTube offered a service where they wouldn't collect any data from you, a YouTube sort of premium too, if you like, but it cost you, 10, 15 quid a month, whatever the equivalent, would people pay for that?
Well, that's the thing. It wouldn't. Well, they might do now, but it wouldn't have got them to where they are.
Yeah.
So I think last time we talked about Twitter and how I think Twitter posted losses for 10 years because they couldn't figure out a way to monetize it. And that's bonkers. A platform that's used by so many people, it's so popular. It's like the de facto way to get news straight away now for people that really want to be cutting edge and actually can't find a way to make it profitable. I think it is now. It has been for the last few years, but
yeah. So I did want to just put that out there, that we weren't simply hammering these companies. If we're having a genuine discussion, we've got to look at how this all kind of. Mm-hmm. A lot of the time, we always I think we've got to think about these things as like a snowball, right? And there's maybe some people give them push one way or the other, but we're not completely innocent in this, I guess.
I suppose where's the middle ground is the question, isn't it? Where is the middle ground? Because like your data is a bit like a helium balloon. As soon as you let it go, it's very hard to get it back from wherever it might end up. You don't know, and then again back to consent. I'm not going to read your terms and conditions. I can't bothered. I'm just going to scroll through it, click agree, fire on, and no wonder 7 or 8 years later everyone's in uproar because they're being made money off of and things like that. So, is there a middle ground? It's the kind of thing that maybe like if there was a standard consensus to what data can and can't be used for, and there were different levels of it and things like that. There was like,
well, I mean, haven't we got another model for this in organ donation? Right, some countries have an opt-in, some countries have an opt-out. Could that not apply to data that you would, opt in or opt out, depending on the political culture? I feel like this has now brought us nicely back round to that other point of. So we had a worry.
You're welcome.
So there was a kind of fear about what they're doing, and that was more of a privacy argument. But then there's also this idea of that they're making money off of us, and there's an entitlement argument to this. And that brings us back to the idea of, well, property is your data. Now, these obviously aren't completely separate, because a lot of people are arguing that the way to protect your privacy is to monetize it. So you get to choose to sell it, because then, you enter into a transaction. And I'm not sure how I feel about that, because that again presumes all this kind of liberal free market economics that will equal in the market, and we're not. But we'll put a big fat pin in that. But so the entitlement has to come from the fact that we feel like that someone's making money off of us. And there is perhaps something in this if we think about the fact that, if these companies are making money on a commodity that they didn't really produce. Now, you can obviously argue that they farm the data. I think that's a good word for that, because they are sort of reaping it, if you like. They are kind of, there is some labour in that. And the reason I mention labour, because that's an important theory of property, right? And it's a very old theory of property, right? It goes all the way back to the philosopher John Locke. It's problematic because it was used basically in very, very harmful ways to justify taking land off of indigenous people in the Americas, right? But you could argue that was a misinterpretation of the theory or not. Again, huge conversation. But I just want to tell you what the theory of property is. So it's probably quite familiar to a lot of people because it's very instinctive. And also we can see Marxism, taking up this theory of property. And it's simply that if you labour something, if you put your sweat and tears into something, you have a claim of ownership over it. And so he talks about, even in a very primeval state, you collect 3 buckets of water, you collect them, and I come along and take one of them. Instinctively, you'll be like, well, you can't do that because I collected them. Now, I don't think that's an abstraction. I think that you have to actually, being a Western kind of capitalist or at least commerce system of property, to imagine that. It's because you'd be thinking differently. For example, if you were perhaps an indigenous person in that context, you wouldn't be thinking that's my bucket of water. You'd be thinking that's my community's, and that's a subtle difference, I think. But we're in a Western system of property, and that's that. We are in that currently, and so another way to think about this, that there's an instinctive truth to it within this system, I guess, is imagine that if I gave you a gift on your birthday and it was a telephone. So,
That's what you said last time.
Sound a bit
Creepy.
Smartphone. And I gave you a smartphone, and you've already got one that's better, so you decide to sell the one I gave you on eBay. I might be a bit annoyed at you, but some people have done that before, and we wouldn't think you were terrible for doing it, perhaps. If I drew a picture of you and put my labour into it, and of course money represents our labour, but it's something that feels different about this, and I gave you that painting and you sold it, or threw it away, or did something with it, I would be more annoyed, and therefore, the reason for that, I think, is it's almost as if I have an echo of ownership over it because I put so much labour into it. So Can we then make that leap? And this is why I think data is so interesting, because it makes us actually, none of these theories of property fully describe for me the situation of data. So we have to actually sort of create a new one. But is there a leap to be had from saying, well, if labouring something gives you an entitlement over the property of it, is it that you kind of going around the internet, looking for things, walking to the shop, buying things, picking things up the shelf, is that almost like you own it because you are physically labouring it? You are creating the content, even though they're taking it because it's their platform, and we've talked about the consent thing. Without you, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, there's a
you
few.
Produce it if you like.
There's a few things in there that I don't know. It makes it hard to give a good answer, I think, or even like to come up to something like a theory of data property. And the first big difference someone highlighted to me once was actually of all things that you can own and have, very few are as easy to replicate as your data. So if you've got a bucket of water, it's very hard for me to go and get another bucket of water. It's very easy for me to just copy your data. And especially in the kind of online world, the labor that goes into copying all your data into my store is absolutely minimal, happens in fractions of a second. So there are very few other possessions that you can have that you can just make more of almost effortlessly. And that's why you're bumbling around the internet, you bump into stuff. You're not actively, like, I'm not sat here actively trying to generate data most of the time. And it's a byproduct of what you're doing anyway. It's what they're doing is actually, it's like they're following you round, sort of brushing up all your little crumbs and bits of dust that you leave as you walk around the internet. But then they use that to make predictions, and they've found a way to almost make money off of your kind of waste. But it is surveillance. It is.
Yeah. I mean, it's very tricky. I mean, like I said, we're not going to get to the bottom of these questions here, right? But I don't think that's really the purpose of our podcast series. The purpose of our podcast series is to talk about these things openly.
No answers.
Well,
no, absolutely zero conclusions.
I'm not going to give you any answers. It's going to create more problems for you.
But so a really interesting solution or type of solution to that problem, I first saw by the guys at DHI Scotland. Really, really interesting. If you look them up, it's DHI-Scotland. That's the Digital Health Institute, because DHI Scotland, all one word, do hair transplants, and it's not them. So DHI-Scotland.
Give me their details.
It's DHI Scotland, all one word. But the DHI built this platform. So they're funded by the NHS and government to do innovative and interesting things in tech for data and healthcare. They've built this platform, and I've seen the demo a few times, and it's quite complicated. So forgive me if I get it wrong, but it's well worth looking at if you find it online. This platform, you as the service user, so I'm someone that wants to put my data into the service. You sign up to it, and it's stored in such a way by DHI Scotland that it is completely encrypted. I think it uses blockchain, or if it doesn't, there was another one I saw that was similar that used blockchain. But it's completely encrypted, and you can't access it without the key. So I've uploaded all my data, all my healthcare data, my notes and things like that to their platform, and they store it, and that's it. No one else can ever look at it. And whenever I want, I can unplug it, and that's it. It's all gone. And then service providers then log into the platform as well. And so the difference, I hadn't really ever thought about it this way, but the reason it's a bit of a problem, the way it is now, is every single service we use have their own databases, their own platform. So we've all got hundreds of logins, hundreds of passwords. So I sign up to Google, and I've signed up separately to Facebook, and I sign up separately to XYZ, and I've got all these different logins, and each one of those individual companies is like a little island that I've left a full copy or a partial copy of my data on, but near complete. So I've left that here, and I've left it there, and I've left it there, and I've not actually gone back to my MySpace data in about 15 years, but it's still there. Someone's still probably got that. I don't know what they did with it, but I left a load of my data in MySpace and probably not thought of that. Tagged, Where Are You Now, I think was another one. Bebo, all those. Like, if you sign up to them, you leave, and they're individual corporations, organizations that hold your data, and they can do what they like with it because you've consented, maybe you've skipped past the terms and conditions and agreed. What DHI Scotland are doing is saying, well, instead of having all the service providers have to take a full copy of your data and then you're giving them ownership of it, we'll keep it and you can trust us. And this is the whole, I think we talked about having to trust third parties. So we'll keep this. You can trust us. And then the service providers also log into the platform. And then, like an app store, you click on the services you want, and whilst you're subscribed to that service or you want to use it, they get access to your data in an encrypted way, which means they can't take it and use it for whatever purposes that you're not agreed to. And at any time you press a button and you're in complete control and the data vanishes and they don't get access to you anymore. And they're doing some really cool stuff with this. One of the examples they gave was around blood pressure cuffs that plug into the iPhone. I didn't know this existed, but blood pressure cuff plugs into the iPhone. There's an app. This app logs into the DHI Scotland platform, and you can take your own blood pressure. Now, it's not medically sound, I think, because you have to take blood pressure a certain way, like you have to be standing up and your arm has to be a certain way or something, but it still gives you a reading. And the idea is you could plug in the app, sign up to the platform, and then you could choose to share that data with your GP. And for some people that need to get their blood pressure checked twice a week, actually, if they could come up with a way of doing that sort of adhered to standards, it might save them to sort of visits to the doctor nurse a week. If the doctor or the GP or whoever could look at that data, trust that it had been secured. That's really cool. That's a really great way to do things. But actually trying to share your data in a trusted way in that regard's really difficult. And there's other systems that copy or have similar methodologies that use blockchain and encrypt the data that way, which is interesting. Whether or not we'll see adoption of tools like that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I think that the reason that's interesting, I'm just going to say this quickly because we need to wrap up, is that we're back at that question again in the pilot episode, right? Like the splitting of the atom. These technologies, I don't think you can work in these technologies and kind of protect yourselves from the consequences of what's going to happen to them, right? So you can't claim to be a neutral data scientist, right? Now, I totally accept that as a controversial claim. But the reason I mention that, right, because we all create these technologies in the full knowledge of where they're going to go is actually going to in a bad place, right? People use them in a bad way. But what's so interesting about that is you've got a company or organization developing the technology at the same time as kind of taking a political stance on it. And that's really interesting. And that's, I think, is a really positive side of this. And that brings on to another point of perhaps we should do another episode of this looking at the positive sides of it, because I feel like we've just critiqued, we've been very critical about this, and I'm sure there's lots of positive things actually that you would want to talk about that data can do. Like you talk about blood pressure, all that kind of stuff, and then we can talk a bit more about a thing called biopolitics, right? Which I think you'll find really interesting. So I think we should have an episode about that.
Cool.
Also, I feel like we should say before we finish that we are planning to do another episode on automation of the workforce, which was our pilot episode. And for that episode, we have a couple of potential guests who've shown an interest in coming on the show. The reason for, because we kind of rambled quite generally about the automation of the workforce.
Surely not.
No, say it so, we did. So that's not a phrase, is it? But so we've got two people. One person working in a certain industry and another working in another profession, very different professions. And so they've used data in very different ways. And I think it would be really cool to take that general conversation about automation of the workforce into two very specific jobs. So if you're interested in listening to that, which will be maybe our next episode, or maybe we'll do our next one on the positive sides of data. And then please do listen to the pilot episode, because that will give you a nice general opening to that. And also an introduction of what's actually going on here, because me and Adam have decided to do this podcast because we basically are friends and
love the sound of our own voice.
Love the sound of our own voices. And he spent a lot of time working in data, and that's his profession. And I am a political philosopher lecturer, so I was interested in bringing these kind of questions, or new moral questions, if you like, that technology and tech brings about. And I also think that we should get an episode lined up to be very current about something I read really recently about one of these tech giants, spokespersons, talking about coronavirus and how in the future we should all be doing stuff digitally, because unlike machines, and this is the quote, humans are biohazards to each other. That's a great example of tech changes going faster, and the sort of psychological, philosophical, moral presumptions all wrapped up in that. Because that quote concerns me, worries the hell out of me. So, and another thing too is we did ask everyone in the pilot episode. We haven't got a name for this podcast yet. We've had 2 suggestions from Dan Smith and John Evans. So maybe we'd like to get up to like 5 name suggestions, and then we'll pick from one of those. I think would be cool.
So I suppose something else to say, if people have topics that they think, I'd love to hear these 2 buffoons waffle about for 40
I can't for life of me think you would, but
then give us a shout.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll probably post this out in the next couple of days, maybe even this evening, depends if Ads does want to go for that run.
Well, look, no, we'll do it tonight, and we won't commit to what day we recorded it on, so...
Oh, yeah! Okay, there we go. Well, thanks very much for listening.
Yeah, the next 5 minutes.
We generally try to keep these around 40 minutes, but this one's gone on perhaps a bit longer than it should. But I think it's because it's just such an interesting topic. So thanks, Ads.
We're just really so interested.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, what else is there to do in lockdown? So, well, thanks very much.
Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, and we'll see you all again soon.